In the early 1800s, America was still a young nation, struggling to define itself. The scars of revolution had not yet fully healed, and the country was divided by geography, industry, and belief. Yet in the small villages of New England, stories were already spreading about a man whose voice could bend crowds, whose words could ignite fires in the human spirit, and whose ambitions seemed limitless. That man was Daniel Webster. Born in 1782 on the rugged farmlands of Salisbury, New Hampshire, Webster was not destined for greatness, at least not in the eyes of his neighbors. He was a sickly child, frail in body, often too weak to work the fields. But what his body lacked, his mind more than compensated for. From the earliest days, he devoured books, memorizing long passages of scripture and classic orations. His teachers claimed his memory was unnatural, as if the words etched themselves onto his soul without effort. By the age of 14, Webster could recite entire sections of the Bible by heart, and his ability to speak, even as a boy, carried a weight that unnerved adults. Neighbors whispered that when Daniel read aloud, it sounded as though the air itself shifted, as though someone or something spoke through him. His father, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, recognized the boy's gifts and sent him to Dartmouth College. There, Webster's rise began. He studied law, but more importantly, he mastered rhetoric, the art of persuasion. Fellow students remembered him standing in candle-lit rooms, delivering speeches that made grown men tremble. One classmate swore that while Webster spoke, shadows on the wall moved against the flame, dancing in shapes that did not match the room's occupants. By the time he was in his 20s, Webster was already making a name for himself in New England courtrooms. He could sway juries as if their verdicts had been written before the trial even began. He never stammered, never faltered, never seemed uncertain. It was as if, one observer noted, he argued with the confidence of a man who knew the outcome before the trial began. Such talent, people whispered, could not be natural. In the deeply religious soil of New England, where Puritan ghosts still haunted the culture, extraordinary gifts often raised suspicion. Some claimed Webster's power came from relentless study. Others insisted it was divine favor. But in taverns and among the superstitious, another theory spread. Daniel Webster had made a bargain. By the 1820s, Webster's reputation stretched far beyond courtrooms. He was elected to Congress, then rose to the Senate, where his booming voice filled the chamber like thunder. His speeches on the Constitution were memorized by school children, reprinted in newspapers, and praised as though they were scripture. Yet behind the admiration was unease. How could one man command such power with words alone? How could he argue both sides of a question with equal brilliance as though truth itself bent to his will? In New England folklore, there had long been tales of men who struck bargains with the devil, fishermen who asked for favorable winds, farmers who prayed for bountiful harvests, musicians who begged for talent beyond mortal reach. But Webster's supposed bargain was different. He had not traded for wealth or land or fame. He had asked, people whispered, for mastery of words, for the ability to make any man believe whatever he wished. And if the devil had granted him that gift, then surely, one day, he would come to collect. It was in these years that the seeds of the most enduring American legend were planted. The legend that Daniel Webster, the great defender of the Constitution, the voice of the Senate, and the pride of New England, might not have risen by talent alone, but by a pact sealed in shadows. By the 1820s, Daniel Webster was more than just a lawyer. He was a phenomenon. In the crowded courtrooms of Boston and Portsmouth, men would travel miles not to hear the verdict of a case, but to hear Webster speak. His voice carried like rolling thunder, deep and commanding, yet smooth enough to soothe even the most hostile crowd. Jurors leaned forward unconsciously. Opposing lawyers, even seasoned ones, sometimes forgot their own arguments, as though the force of Webster's words drained them of will. Observers swore that strange things happened when Webster argued. In one trial, the flames of the courtroom's oil lamps flickered wildly during his closing speech, though no draft could be found. In another, a clock stopped at the precise moment Webster reached the peak of his oration, only to resume ticking once he sat down. A clerk later wrote in his diary, "It was as if time itself bowed to him." It was in these years that whispers of something darker began to circulate. Farmers at taverns muttered that Webster must have the devil's tongue. Servants claimed that after particularly long arguments, his eyes glowed faintly in the lamplight, as though lit from within. More than one juror admitted privately that while listening to him, they felt not persuaded, but compelled, as if an unseen hand guided their judgment. His reputation only grew in Washington. In the Senate chambers, he could silence a room with a single phrase. His speeches on union and liberty were so powerful that even his rivals admitted defeat. "He does not argue," one congressman said bitterly. "He commands." And yet, with every triumph, came a new rumor. Webster, it was said, had once been seen alone in his study, pacing back and forth as though arguing with someone who was not there. The servant who spied him swore he heard two voices, Webster's deep baritone and another, lower, rasping, inhuman. By the late 1820s, an unsettling pattern had emerged. Webster did not simply win cases, he won impossible cases. Farmers caught red-handed in theft walked free. Merchants, ruined by debt, escaped their creditors. Even men accused of violence were acquitted after Webster's booming oratory filled the courtroom. Some said it was genius. Others whispered that no mortal could bend justice so far without help from below. The common folk began to retell an old story with a new twist, that Daniel Webster had stood at a crossroads one stormy night, and in exchange for his soul, he had demanded one gift. That no jury could resist his words. He did not ask for riches, the tale went, nor for long life. He asked for victory in every argument, and the devil, admiring his cleverness, granted it. Of course, Webster himself never spoke of such things. Publicly, he was a man of reason, of law, of the Constitution. But the rumors only grew stronger, fueled by the uncanny energy he radiated in court. At times, his speeches left men trembling, pale, or even sick, as though they had been drained of something vital. One young lawyer fainted outright during a Webster argument, later claiming he felt as though the very air had turned to fire. To his admirers, Webster was a genius beyond measure. To his enemies, he was something far more dangerous, a man who had bartered with forces better left unspoken. And as the 1830s dawned, these whispers would coalesce into one of the strangest and most enduring legends in American folklore. The tale of Daniel Webster facing the devil himself in a courtroom not of men, but of souls. By the 1830s, Daniel Webster's reputation was no longer bound by the walls of Congress or the courts of New England. He had become a figure of myth, his name spoken not only in political circles, but in hushed tones across taverns, churches, and farmhouses. And it was in this era that the most famous story, the one that would define his legend for centuries, began to spread. The story was always told in whispers, and like all great folklore, the details shifted depending on who told it. But the core never changed. There was once, they said, a poor New England farmer, desperate for land, money, and security for his family. Times were hard, and though he prayed for relief, none came. One night, in the shadow of his barn, he met a stranger, tall, cloaked in black, with eyes that glowed faintly red in the darkness. The man promised him what he desired: prosperity, fertile fields, animals that would not sicken, and gold enough to keep his family fed for generations. The price was his soul. The farmer signed the contract in blood, as the old tales always said, and for a time he prospered. His land yielded more than ever before. His children never went hungry, his barns filled with wheat and cattle. But the day came, as it always does, when the stranger returned to collect his due. Desperate, the farmer sought help. But who could stand against the devil himself? Only one man, the townsfolk whispered. Daniel Webster. In the legend, Webster agreed to defend the farmer, not in a mortal court, but in a trial set deep in the woods, under the cover of night. A bonfire marked the courtroom. The jury was drawn from the damned, murderers, thieves, traitors long dead. At the bench sat the devil himself, dressed like a gentleman, his eyes burning like coals. The farmer trembled. Webster did not. When the devil presented the blood-signed contract, Webster rose to speak, and in the tale, his voice that night carried more than human force. He did not argue about laws or contracts. He spoke of America itself, of freedom, of independence, of the rights of every man to choose his own destiny. He thundered about liberty, about the sacrifices made by the living and the dead to build a nation where no tyrant, no king, and no devil had the right to enslave a soul. As he spoke, the damned jury shifted uneasily. Their faces, twisted by sin, softened, their eyes filled with tears. For the first time since their deaths, they remembered what it was to be human. The devil objected, of course. He raged, declaring that the contract was binding, that no man could escape it. But Webster, according to the tale, turned on him with such fury that even the Prince of Darkness fell silent. "You cannot claim what is not yours by right," Webster is said to have shouted. "For no man, living or dead, can sign away the eternal freedom granted by his Creator, not to kings, not to tyrants, and not to you." The jury returned with their verdict. The farmer was free. The woe contract, they declared, was void. And in that moment, the devil's power was broken, at least for one night. The legend ends differently depending on who told it. Some said the devil vanished in smoke, leaving only the smell of sulfur. Others claimed he bowed to Webster, admitting defeat, and promised that one day they would meet again. But all versions agreed on one thing. Daniel Webster had done what no mortal man had ever done. He had stood face to face with the devil and won. Of course, historians would later insist the story was folklore, a morality tale woven by common folk who admired Webster's brilliance. But to the people of New England, it explained everything. His voice, his impossible victories, his unshakable presence. It all made sense if he had once stared into the abyss and forced it to yield. And so, as his political power grew, so too did the legend. Daniel Webster was no longer just a statesman or a lawyer. He was a man touched by forces beyond mortal reckoning. Whether blessed or cursed, no one could say. By the 1840s, Daniel Webster was no longer just a lawyer or even a senator. He was a titan of American politics, spoken of in the same breath as Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, the great triumvirate that shaped the destiny of the young republic. Webster's speeches echoed in Congress like scripture. Newspapers printed his words on their front pages as though they were national proclamations. Children in schools memorized his phrases, and foreign diplomats marveled at his authority. And yet, As his power reached its height, so too did the whispers of the bargain. The folk tale of Webster defeating the devil was told and retold, embroidered with new details each time. Farmers said the devil had sworn revenge. Others insisted Webster's victories in law and politics came with a hidden cost, that every compromise, every step forward, demanded something in return. And slowly, his career began to reflect the unease of these whispers. Webster, the man who had once thundered about liberty, found himself making deals that seemed to betray those very ideals. He became a defender of the Constitution above all else, even when it meant upholding slavery to preserve the fragile Union. In 1850, he delivered one of his most famous and infamous speeches supporting the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Act. To many abolitionists, it was a betrayal so profound they never forgave him. Crowds that once adored him began to jeer. Former allies turned cold. "He speaks with the voice of angels," one abolitionist said bitterly, "but for the cause of demons." And in this political unraveling, the rumors of a curse grew stronger. Some claimed that Webster's words had begun to falter. In private, he stumbled over lines, repeated phrases, or lost his place entirely, things unthinkable for the great orator of old. Servants whispered that he spent long nights pacing, muttering as though arguing with unseen opponents. A visitor to his study swore he heard Webster say, in a tone not his own, "A bargain is a bargain." Even his physical presence seemed altered. The once commanding figure grew stooped, his eyes shadowed, his skin pale and drawn. There were nights, witnesses said, when he looked less like a man and more like a ghost in his own skin. Superstition filled the gaps that politics could not explain. Preachers in New England pulpits warned that no man could serve two masters, and hinted, without naming him, that Webster's fall was proof. Farmers, in taverns, whispered that the devil had come to collect at last, and that Webster's compromises in Congress were not acts of politics, but signs of a debt being paid. There were stranger stories still. In the months following his compromise speech, several witnesses claimed they saw a tall figure in black following Webster as he walked the streets of Washington, always at a distance, never with a face. It was like a shadow, one young aide recalled, that did not belong to him. Others swore that in the Senate chamber itself during one of his final speeches, a dark shape flickered across the ceiling, a shadow cast by no man. The lamps dimmed for a moment, and for the briefest instant, Webster's booming voice seemed to echo with another lower tone, as though he were not speaking alone. By the late 1840s, Webster's political influence had waned. He remained a towering figure in name, but the compromises he made had tarnished his legacy. His enemies claimed he had traded principle for power. His friends whispered he had lost his way. But among the common folk, the conclusion was simpler, more terrifying. Daniel Webster had struck a bargain, and the bargain was running out. The man who once could bend juries and senates alike with a single phrase now seemed trapped, his great gift twisted into a burden. His rise had been meteoric, his triumphs legendary. But like all such stories, the price was coming due, and soon the shadows that had haunted his career would come for him in earnest. By the year 1852, Daniel Webster was a man in visible decline. The once unshakable lion of the Senate now appeared tired, broken, and haunted. His health faltered. His speeches, once thunderbolts, grew halting and uncertain. Though he still carried immense prestige, whispers followed him everywhere. Not of politics, but of curses, bargains, and the shadow of the devil. At his estate in Marshfield, Massachusetts, servants described nights of terror. Webster would pace the halls long past midnight, a candle in one hand, muttering arguments to himself. or to something no one else could see. He often stopped suddenly, as if someone had spoken back, and would answer aloud in tones of defiance or despair. One maid swore she heard him say in a low, trembling voice, "You'll not have me yet. Not until the country is whole." But the country was anything but whole. The Compromise of 1850 had not eased tensions. It had worsened them. Slavery, the issue Webster had tried to push aside for the sake of unity, was tearing the nation apart. His political choices left him vilified in the North, distrusted in the South, and abandoned by many of his old allies. The mighty orator who once seemed untouchable was now seen as a tragic figure, consumed by contradictions. And yet the strangest stories of his final years had little to do with politics. Neighbors in Marshfield claimed that on stormy nights, lights glowed in Webster's study long after everyone else had gone to bed. Those who dared walk past the estate swore they saw shadows moving across the windows, not one, but two, locked in a silent struggle. Some insisted they heard a deep, unearthly voice echoing faintly on the wind, like laughter carried from far away. Webster himself admitted to terrible dreams. Friends recorded him describing visions of black dogs prowling his property, their eyes glowing like coals. In one dream, he claimed, he saw the Senate chamber filled with faceless men, all pointing at him, chanting a single word, "Guilty." By September 1852, Webster's health collapsed. He was bedridden with cirrhosis and other ailments, weakened beyond recovery. As he lay dying, his family gathered close, but what they witnessed has become the stuff of legend. In his final days, Webster often cried out in his sleep, reaching toward the corners of the room as though fending something off. At times, his booming courtroom voice returned, as if he were arguing a case unseen. "I will not yield," he shouted one night, startling his attendants. "The bargain was for my voice, not my soul." On October 24th, as the first light of dawn broke, Daniel Webster finally passed away. But according to several witnesses, his death was far from peaceful. One servant swore that just before he died, Webster's eyes widened in terror, fixed on a corner of the room where no one else saw anything. He whispered a final phrase, "The debt is paid," and then fell silent forever. Outside, a violent storm suddenly rolled in from the sea, battering Marshfield with wind and rain. Locals later said it was as if the heavens themselves had come to claim him. But the legends did not end with his death. In the months that followed, stories spread across New England that Webster's ghost walked the halls of his estate at night. Travelers swore they saw a tall, dark figure with a candle wandering the grounds, his face pale, his eyes hollow. Some claimed they heard the faint boom of his voice carried on the wind, as though he were still arguing, not with men, but with the devil who had pursued him in life. To this day, the Webster house in Marshfield is said to be haunted. Locals whisper that if you stand outside on a stormy night, you can hear his voice through the shutters, locked in an eternal debate. Some say he won his bargain and kept his soul. Others believe the devil claimed him at last. And what people hear is not Daniel Webster's spirit at all, but something far darker. In either case, his story has never been just that of a politician. It has always been something more. The tale of a man who rose higher than most, but who, in the end, could not escape the shadows that followed him. Daniel Webster's death marked the end of an era in American politics. He had been one of the towering voices of the 19th century, a man whose words shaped law, inspired generations, and echoed in the very foundations of the Union. Yet his legacy has never been simple. Historians remember him as a brilliant orator, a defender of the Constitution, and one of the greatest legal minds America has ever produced. But they also remember his compromises, his political missteps, and the choices that stained his reputation. In life, he was larger than most men, and in death, he became larger still, transformed into myth. For even now, nearly 2 centuries later, his story is told not only in classrooms and history books, but in hushed voices around New England fireplaces. To some, he is the noble defender who once defeated the devil himself. To others, he is the man who made a bargain he could never escape. The legends say that Webster's ghost still roams his Marshfield estate, pacing the halls by candlelight, forever rehearsing arguments only he can hear. On stormy nights, fishermen claim they can hear his voice rolling across the waves, booming and defiant, as though still trying to outwit the devil on some higher stage. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Daniel Webster, that he was a man who seemed to stand halfway between history and folklore. A man whose power of speech was so great that it blurred the line between mortal and myth, between politics and the supernatural. Was he truly cursed? Did he strike a bargain that cost him his soul? Or was the tragedy of Daniel Webster nothing more than the story of a man too great for his own time, undone by the very compromises he thought would save his country? The answer may never be known, but one thing is certain. Daniel Webster's life reminds us that power always comes at a price, that greatness can summon shadows as easily as light, and that sometimes the stories we whisper about a man can become just as real and just as haunting as the man himself. And so his name lives on, caught between history and legend, fact and folklore. Daniel Webster, the statesman, the orator, the man who may have bargained with the devil, and who, even in death, refuses to stop arguing his case. And so, the legend of Daniel Webster lingers, part history, part folklore, part shadow of something darker. Was he truly a man cursed by his own ambitions, or simply a politician whose compromises left scars on his soul? Perhaps both truths exist side by side, woven together the way only America's oldest legends can be. One thing is undeniable. People still whisper his name. Visitors to Marshfield say that when the wind rattles the shutters and the waves crash against the shore, they can hear his voice. Deep, commanding, unyielding, locked in eternal debate with something unseen. Some even claim that on stormy nights the devil himself comes calling, and that Webster's ghost still refuses to surrender the final word. What do you think? Was Daniel Webster's story one of politics and tragedy, or of pacts and curses? Did he truly face down the devil, or did he become one of the devil's most persuasive allies? Let us know in the comments what you believe. And if you enjoyed this journey into one of America's most haunting legends, make sure to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this story with someone who loves history's darkest mysteries. Because sometimes the past isn't finished with us, and sometimes the dead still argue their case.